Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to our afternoon discussion here about the cybersecurity changes for healthcare in 2023. And boy, there are a lot of them. We have a lot of material to talk to you about. But first, I want to welcome you and say it's nice to see you all. I see somebody's already in the chat saying hello from Salt Lake City. I love Salt Lake City. We have some folks at a conference in Salt Lake City this week. Um, and if you have not been to our events before, want to welcome you. If you've been, want to welcome you back. It's nice to see you. Yeah, lots to talk about today. I will not surprise anybody that because of ransomware, because of what's happened, there has been a massive push for change in healthcare. And I don't think it is a secret to anybody that, of the various industries, healthcare is sometimes the one that is slowest to change, certainly in IT posture. And so what we're seeing now is a lot of regulatory changes pushing down to hospitals. I was just at the American Hospital Association Rural Conference a couple of months ago with Mike, we talked to one CFO who said, "Wow, it feels like what the feds are telling us to do is changing so fast." So we decided we're going to put this together um, for folks in healthcare. Um, Things to know. So we're going to do introductions. We're going to talk about the threat landscape. We're going to talk about what some rural healthcare CIOs are dealing with, and what to do about today's challenges. Joining me today, Mike Hamilton. Mike and Fred co-founded the company. Mike is our CISO and chief speaker about Russian hacking and other things like that. Fred Langston spent a long time, dozens, hundreds of years in healthcare cybersecurity. I like to give him flack about how long. He's now our chief product officer. But Fred, I think one thing that's important for folks to know is that you were on the original committee that suggested the language for the HIPAA security rule. And gives you context of Fred's background in this. And then Jonathan Inskeep used to be one of our customers, and he was the CIO at Caribou Medical Center. And Jonathan, am I right? It's 25 bed in Idaho, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so it sort of gives you a sense. So Jonathan, has been in the seats of many of the folks. I'm looking at the audience of where many of you are. My name's Jake Milstein. I run marketing for Critical Insight, and I run our events. And I watch the chat, and I will, if you put questions in there, I will ask them of the people in the audience. So who are we? If you don't know us, Critical Insight defends critical services against cyber attacks. The federal government is now calling all of you critical infrastructure, whether you are, no matter where you are in healthcare, whether you work for a public health agency or whether you work for a critical access hospital. And that is our mission, is helping you prepare for a cyber attack, helping you detect one rapidly, and help you respond decisively. And that's who we are. That's who we are as a company. And that's why the American Hospital Association chose us as a preferred choice for hospitals, that we provide managed detection response, which is that catching the intruders very quickly, providing risk assessments, and continuous vulnerability identification. And we haven't added to the graphic. We're about to announce that we renewed our partnership with the American Hospital Association, that we're a preferred provider again, and added incident response preparedness. And preparedness is a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So that's a really important topic. But Fred, let's jump into it. And I do want to say to people, go ahead, let us. People are already doing this, but let us know in the chat where you're joining from. Love to say hi, and if you have questions, I love interrupting Fred. So put questions in the chat, and I'll interrupt Fred with your questions. Fred, go ahead.
Okay. So let's give a little HIPAA history here. So going back to mid 90s, the very first cybersecurity compliance rule was HIPAA, came out. We did our best effort at the time. Very kind of, in some ways, lightweight in terms of the prescriptive guidance you see today. But it was a first pass, right? It was anyone's first pass at this. And then in 2008, the HIPAA amendment with high trust, or excuse me, high tech, the high tech amendment to that. And basically, what that did, it said, your business associates that we've always kind of had an arm's length relationship with, guess what? You're going to be subject to audits. You're going to be subject to the same scrutiny that anybody is, the providers or the clearinghouses or the payers, because frankly, a lot of the breaches are happening with you, business associates. So they got a lot tougher around business associates. And they also put out notifications saying, people, you need to do true risk assessment. Most of what we're seeing are gap analysis. First step, you got to complete it, get the risk assessment component included in there as well. Then kind of about another 3 or 4 years later, we got some help in the OCR, Office of Civil Rights, under Department of Health and Human Services, put out their audit guide, which was really useful because it gave us the perspective of how did they look at compliance with HIPAA? And that was a real useful tool for us to say, well, let's align with the questions they're going to ask in a audit, and that'll more directly allow us to address the concerns that OCR cares about. So what's happened now? Well, they've kind of stepped back. They've taken a big look at things and said, HIPAA needs to cover a lot more of the environment than just the places and systems that have EPHI, right? Electronic Protected Health Information. The common breach scenario now is, let's go attack a system that's not part of our EPHI infrastructure. Maybe it's an HR system, right? Or maybe it's in marketing. Sorry, Jake. And they attack that system and then they pivot. Right now they have a foothold on the inside. Now they're going to go after those EPHI containing systems. So the government, in their wisdom, said, you know what? We've always been trying to dial it down to your EPHI environment. Well, guess what? That's not where the initial attack is going to be. So they said, okay. And we've actually been encouraging people to take this view for about 6-7 years now. You have to look at everything, right? Your entire environment will become an attack surface on which you can pivot towards HIPAA containing systems with EPHI. So they've said, look more broadly, right? Look at all the avenues of attack. It doesn't mean just look at EPHI containing systems. And it also said, we want to lean into the NIST cybersecurity framework. And if you haven't heard of that before, it is put out by the National Institutes of Standards and Testing, one of the main standards body by the U.S. government. And they built the CSF about 10 or 11 years ago, maybe 12, 13 years ago now. And it was built to really address critical infrastructure. Well, healthcare is now fully, frankly, it always was, under critical infrastructure. So they're saying this is an appropriate tool to use. Why do we like it? Because the NIST cybersecurity framework is outcome-based. That was the one reason we went with risk assessment when we built the initial HIPAA regulation, was to give people the way to say, one size does not fit all. This is what is appropriate for my organization based on the risk, based on our budgets and things like that. Well, that's why they like the NIST CSF, because it's outcome-based as well. It doesn't say you will have a packet filtering, stateful inspection firewall that does X, Y, and Z. It says you will control access in and out of your environment and based on that access on the principle of least privilege. So it's telling you what they want, not telling you how to do it. So this aligns with the previous HIPAA approach. It's a perfect kind of shift to expand and give people that latitude to build a program that meets their needs and their budget. But other things are starting to really kind of press on this, right? There's the False Claims Act. So that's the Federal Trade Commission saying, wait a minute, you are putting out on your website that you are HIPAA compliant and you have these programs and these controls in place. And guess what? You got breached and you don't. So you were telling people that you did. Now you're under a trade commission because you made false claims about what you're doing. And now you're bypassing the HIPAA problem and you're going straight to the FTC, which could potentially put an enforcement action and fines on you as well.
And a consent decree, which is
consent decree. There you go.
Which the FTC is going to be snooping around your business for a long time.
There you go. And so there's also, that California Consumer Privacy Act. Now we're basically have our own version of GDPR. Other states are starting to put similar legislation in place. So this means, again, we need to understand what do we do when people's information has been breached? And we talked about preparation. A big part of it is understanding how are you going to answer those very difficult and expensive questions. If you answer them wrong, you pay a lot more because you claim, you're trying to claim this minimal amount of records that are exposed. If you don't have a way to determine that, you're going to say every record was exposed, and you're going to send out a letter to every customer you have. So very important. It still aligns with the HIPAA approach, but now you've got the whole kind of California framework that talks about how you use that data as well. The SEC, of course, if anybody is publicly traded, big hospital consortiums tend to be. Now you have to make sure that you are you have regulatory guidance on the board. And then another component of this is GLBA, the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, if you are doing collections. So one of the biggest EPHI breaches of 2022 was a medical collections company. It wasn't a care provider, wasn't an insurer. It was a collections company, and they had 20 plus million breaches, and over 650 healthcare organizations all had to report that they had a breach. Because if you remember how it works, business associates don't announce to the world they had a breach. Every one of the people that they signed a business associate agreement with are the ones that are responsible for announcing the breach. So all these people did not know they had this huge risk coming in from their medical billing.
Yeah, I want to talk about that quarterly filings business right there.
Sure.
I actually think this is an important nuance here because they've been extremely vigorous about, the SEC has been very vigorous about enforcing this. And so in your filings where you are enumerating risks to your publicly traded organization, if you use weasel word language like we may suffer an impact to our business from a cyber event. If you actually did suffer that and you used the word may, they'll fine you. That is how exacting they want you to be when you're talking about risk and you're reporting that out to shareholders and investors and et cetera, et cetera. And this is all being scrutinized very carefully right now. And I realize, most hospitals, probably a lot on here, are not publicly traded, but I think that's an important one.
Yep. And then there's the whole world of medical devices, right? I think everybody's starting to finally wake up. Medical devices are where we are generating a significant amount of our EPHI. And if we're not securing those and we don't understand how to secure those, we're going to be behind the eight ball. So what the new guidance is, before it was so they had guidance in two pieces. There was pre-introduction. In other words, if you're a device manufacturer, you need to do all these things. Then there was a post-release guide. In other words, if you're a user of these are all the things you should be doing. Well, these have always been guidelines. Well, the pre-release, pre-introduction has now become hard-coded. They have to follow this guidance. They have not yet said to the healthcare providers, you will now also have to comply with the post-release or the implementation component of that medical device. That is coming, folks. So start getting your biomedical teams aligned with security, because most of them don't think about security. They think about, I need to make sure that this drug infusion pump is providing, accurate reporting and dosage, right? But security is now going to be something that is going to be on their plate. Most of them don't even realize that is a thing. So make sure you let them know security will be a responsibility of theirs coming up. And lastly, I just want to point out, pretty much every organization takes credit cards. So almost every medical organization we go to, I say, you take credit cards? Yep. Well, what are you doing for PCI DSS? Well, I think somebody fills out a form once a year. Well, guess what, folks? You have a credit card breach. They're going to be in there with the tweezers and the magnifying glass, and they're going to find all the other things that are wrong. And then you're going to have a HIPAA potential violation on your hands right behind a credit card breach. So do not neglect the other components of your environment. Next slide.
Fred, I just wanted to point out really fast, you got the California Consumer Privacy Act. The hospital that I worked for was right on the Oregon Trail map, right? And so we got people in that hospital from all different states, different countries and stuff like that. So when you start talking about these things, you also have to know the laws that are regulated by your fan base, right? So all the customers that come in from all these different locations, you also got to know how to respond to those different states and or countries.
That's a fantastic analogy. So one of the original things that was determined was, when it comes to GDPR, what if a European citizen has an emergency and walks in the door and I need to be treated at a healthcare organization? Does that mean instantaneously that organization needs to be GDPR compliant in an instant, right? So the government finally looked at that and said, well, if you're providing this kind of care, it does not mean that instantaneously you have become part of GDPR. But if you continue to provide care to those particular patients, you will then need to become compliant with GDPR. So there is a carve out for this person walked in the door. We were not going to turn them away. We wanted to give them, a healthcare service. Yes, it's a European citizen, but no, we don't advertise. We don't have marketing campaigns trying to bring these people in. It was an incidental. So they will let you give you that kind of one-off break. But if you say, oh, and this person is going to continue here for treatment for the next 6 months, that's a different story. All right, next slide, Jake. All right, let's see what that next slide looks like. Doesn't seem to be, there we go. All right, so I mentioned NIST before. NIST is a wonderful storehouse of what are the best practices for just about anything in computing. 800-66 is about incident response, in this particular case, HIPAA incident response. And there is now Rev 2, revision number 2 that's come out. What does this change? What is it kind of added to this? Well, it said exactly kind of what we were talking about before, that you got to look at everything. When you're doing your incident response and you're planning, it needs to talk about any place, software as a service, on-prem systems, cloud, if you're storing things in the cloud. It needs to talk about your business associates, right? So it needs to talk about any place EPHI goes, your IR plan needs to cover that. And a lot of IR plans you read, they talk about an on-prem instance. Maybe it's an email compromise, and they talk about fixing the email system. Well, what do you do if it's a business associate? What do you do if it's a software as a service, right? You need to understand in what they call the shared responsibility model, your software as a service provider will say, this is what we do. Everything else is left to you. If your plan does not pick up right where that shared responsibility model statement from your provider ends, you have a gap, you have a hole. And if you have that hole, that means things are going to break. And that's where the bad guys are going to kind of sit and grind on you until somebody figures out you drop the ball. So you really need to think holistically about your plan, all the areas in which you may have to enact this. And the one thing we continuously tell people is your plan should make decisions, critical decisions, before you're in the middle of an incident. The one thing we commonly see is we see a plan and there's no decision on, are we going to pay the insurance or not? Excuse me, are we going to pay the ransom or not? Or is insurance going to pay the ransom? What does that mean? How does that change things? Also know that 80% of organizations that reported they will not pay a ransom, 80% of those ended up in a breach actually paying the ransom. So while everybody says we're not going to do that, you absolutely have to plan for the eventuality that you may, in fact, end up doing what you said you're not going to do. So don't say, oh, we can forget about that because we said we're not going to do that. Well, that's not how the world works. So you need to consider every eventuality. So we are continuously telling people the way you manage one of the most important parts of the risk equation, the impact, right? There's the risk of somebody taking advantage of a vulnerability and doing something bad. Okay, that's preventative controls. We can manage the impact, the other component that goes into risk, by having an incident response plan that's well written, covers everything, includes all the decisions you need to make ahead of time, including having your CMO understand that they may have to make the decision to transfer patients. And if your CMO is not ready to make that decision, you probably missed maybe one of the most important steps your plan should have. We find it all the time that the CMO does not even know an IR plan exists. Well, they have to be front and center. They're going to be the ones making the decision to move patients, right? And then there is all the things that go into recovery to make sure that you can get back up off the ground and on your feet and back operational and off the pencil and paper, right? Because we know plenty of healthcare organizations have had to do that horrific, hey, we don't have computers anymore, break out the pencil and paper. And then when this is all over, we'll spend a couple months trying to enter all that data back in and get back up. So all of these things need to be taken into account if you want to have a robust and a program that, frankly, is going to minimize the impacts, the bad things that are going to happen to you.
Hey, Fred, along that lines, what's interesting when you talk about incident response planning, when you do have to break it back to paper, what seems to happen a lot, and I've seen this even in my own environment when I was in there, was the paper does not actually match up with the current environment, right? So it's outdated paperwork that's there. And so, I mean, when you're looking at an incident response plan, if you have to fall back to paper, those are things that you need to look at to make sure that those are updated with your current organizational environment.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to the value of practicing your plan at least annually, and at least a tabletop exercise, ideally a functional exercise, especially if you're going to practice something like DR. You got to go kick out a cable and see what happens. But it's that practice that builds that muscle memory.
Yeah, so two things. One, there's a story that I tell where there was an organization I was talking to, hospital, and I'd ask them, hey, how often do you update your incident response plan? And they said, oh, we update all the time. I'm like, oh, read me the first two paragraphs. And they got to the second paragraph and it said, call Joe. And they both looked at each other and they said, who's Joe? Joe had left several years ago. And so that update is important. Fred, the question in the audience here is whether R2 officially released or are they still finalizing it? This is 66 R2, as if I'm remembering right, came out last year. And it's the NIST CSF 2.0 that we're still waiting for. That's different, that we'll talk about here in a second. Is that right?
That's my check, but I'm checking to make sure while we're talking. So
I think some new guidance on this 66R2 just came out, and it was this specifically about anywhere there is EPHI, even if it's through a service provider, third party, something like that, has to be included in your response planning and practicing.
Got it.
Okay. Yeah, I do have a current version, so it looks like it is current and out.
All right. Mike.
Okay. So Fred talked about regulatory changes, and a lot of the regulatory changes are not coming from Health and Human Services Office of Civil Rights. A lot of them are coming from financial regulators like the SEC. And I threw in the chat there, we actually should have had New York's Department of Financial Services on that list as well, because they have really been doing stretching the envelope, shall we say, on regulating businesses that operate in New York State. And they've been the source of a lot of really interesting enforcement efforts. Now let's talk about threats, because this stuff is changing as well. So you notice there's a couple of headlines from recent news over there on the left. And I use these to illustrate that rather than going strictly after hospitals, which was kind of in the beginning, those were the great extortion targets because of the criticality of the services that are provided, the fact that they probably all have insurance, et cetera, can't stand downtime, got to get back, probably the shortest route to paying an extortion demand. The trend is now, it's not changing all the way. Hospitals still get hit. You read about it every day, but they're going after these kind of one-stop shop organizations. So Fortra, they were able to get at 130 companies. MCA that's a dental consortium right there. 9 million people. I think the first instance of something like this was how many years ago was the Blackbaud? It was like 2 years ago. Blackbaud Blackbaud is a provider of financial management services for nonprofits, a lot of the healthcare sector, certain organizations that exist to engage in philanthropy, things like that. And when Blackbaud got hit, they actually had access to a lot of health records. And all of a sudden, all of those institutions started having file their own breach reports, ending up on the wall of shame when it wasn't them that did it. So this is why I think some of that 66R2 guidance is coming out the way it is, because this has become this trend. Another trend is, and I'll dive into this a little deeper when we talk about what the federal government has done for the healthcare sector. There seems to be fewer instances of ransomware knocking down an entire hospital operation versus we're going to steal your records, but instead of monetizing those in a dark web, and we know that those records have value. I think the established value of a health record, depending on what's in, is about $400 versus primarily financial record was about $200. And so the Ponemon Institute goes and surveys people and figures all this out. So clearly you can monetize the sale of the records, but they're not doing that. They're holding them in abeyance for the extortion to be paid. Because the alternative is we will make these public. You're going to get fined. The regulators are going to stand on your neck. The brand damage will be there. There may be class action involved now. As Fred was talking about the California Consumer Privacy Act and others that are popping up in states because our federal government can't figure out how to do a privacy statute. It's that private right of action in there. And the wording in the CCPA says you do not have to have experienced any kind of fraud with your record in order to have standing. What that translates to is there are ambulance chasing attorneys, if I can use that term, that are waiting for these things to happen so that they can move in with a class action suit as soon as there is a big records breach. So this records extortion rather than ransomware is becoming more and more popular, and we see more of that. Nation states, I'll talk about that in a minute, but they are appearing with more regularity, and the tools they use are different and frankly deadly. Smaller organizations like physician groups, there was a consortium of eye doctors, optometrists, things like that, ophthalmologists. They got smacked, and so they're really out there looking for the unlocked windows. The smaller organizations, the ones that obviously can't make the kind of resource investments to align with these regulatory requirements and be straight with the federal government. So when something like this happens, that is when the FTC comes in with this False Claims Act. You guys were supposed to be doing all this stuff. You continue to operate as if you were. Your pronouncements on your websites and in your marketing say, we care about the security and privacy of your data, and you all blew it. Here come the fines, and the consent decree. This is a trend that we continue to see as well. If an organization is a combination, and Fred talked a little bit about how they have gone after various collection agencies, payers, companies, organizations that are a combination of financial technology, for example, payers and collections and things like that, and health, those are the top of the target list. Because the aggregate, the value of the records there, those are the ones that are probably going to get monetized, because if you have health data and you have financial data, the fraud can be unlimited. So here are some changes to the threats. I don't think anyone on this webinar is going to be surprised by that. You all see it happening all the time. But these are things that we have noticed, and these are some of the things that come out in our biannual healthcare breach report, which I believe is coming up soon again.
Sure is.
Go ahead, unless somebody wants to add anything.
Yeah, Fred, Jonathan, do you want to add anything here? And then there's a question in the chat, Fred, for you.
I'll jump in on Scott's question there in the chat. Scott asked, it appears that the responsibility for medical devices is really on the manufacturers and not providers, and that's really the case. And I will tell you, it is, in fact, really the
It's
case.
coming. It's not there yet.
Yeah. But it was this very latest update to the FDA guidelines for medical devices that put teeth into going after the device manufacturers. That's first time there's actually been teeth. Interestingly, if you want to know what is the best practice for medical devices, well, there's actually 6 competing documents or standards all trying to make claims. I don't know which one's going to win. We have one that we like better than others. If people are interested in that list, I'll be happy to send it to them. But there's actually 6 competing. Here's what you should do if you're a medical provider to secure your devices. So there is nothing yet that says you as a provider need to do anything more than what you're doing for any other HIPAA device. A lot of people, we still go out and find people doing their HIPAA risk assessments, not including medical devices. OCR is not going to be happy to see that, folks. That's where your EPHI is going to generate it. Got to include those.
Yeah, I was going to say that that's really a shared governance. I mean, it is coming to the manufacturer to be held accountable for security controls and stuff for those devices. But you, as a network administrator in your environment, you also have to keep that control. So whether that product's there, updated or not, you have to make sure that that's segmented appropriately, that that's not going to be a problem on your network infrastructure.
Yeah. If you've got medical devices commuting out to the internet, you got a problem, right? That should not be happening. Full stop.
Yeah, and I'll just I'll tie that off and say that part, if not all, of the impetus for the FDA going out to regulate medical device manufacturers is because of the National Cybersecurity Strategy, which recognizes that the responsibility for securing an environment has for too long been on end users of technology and not on the manufacturers of technology that could do a whole lot better job. And so, 2 things that they talk about is the IoT seal of approval. So if you can, it's like what they want it to be like is kind of an Underwriter Labs designation where this is secure out of the box. We have a vulnerability identification strategy, and we have a way to ensure that updates and patches get into the hands of all of our customers, right? So then you get the seal of approval, not unlike some of the common criteria stuff that's always existed, and that may even be co-opted for that. And I'll get back to the federal government in a minute, but I do want to point this out even briefly here, that it's not all criminality. There are strategic goals for different countries that actually can be met by knocking down our healthcare sector. And as we see geopolitical tension around the world, especially with what's going on in Russia and the fact that there are a lot of volunteers there that are patriotic, who don't care what they knock down. Iranians in particular have been using more and more tools called wipers, which look a lot like ransomware, but you can't get your data back. It's just gone forever. Goodbye. So think about those backups. And North Koreans also don't care what they knock down. They are very specifically stealing money. They're using ransomware in healthcare organizations to steal money. It's not to meet a strategic goal in terms of making Americans very dissatisfied with the services that are provided by the state and the health sector, things like that. They're stealing money to use on weapons programs, and they are not stopping. So these are all bulletins that have been put out recently by the FBI and CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency that's part of Homeland Security. Keep an eye on these guys, because when they make a report like this, they will put indicators of compromise, the different kinds of tactics that you can expect to see, things that you can actually monitor for. We ingest a lot of that information so that we set traps, right? When they announce these indicators of compromise and these tools, tactics, procedures being used, this is serious business. And as again, when stuff gets weird in Taiwan, weird stuff is going to happen here. I have a theory about how much of our personal information is being held by the Chinese through the Office of Personnel Management. A lot of federal agencies' personnel records were stolen when the Solar Winds event happened. Equifax data never showed up online, and I think that is all in the possession of the Chinese government, who could really throw a whole lot of computing power at stuff. And if they wanted to do fraud at scale to really give us something else to worry about other than what's going on in the South China Sea and in Taiwan, they're fully prepared to do that. So, and I don't want this to turn into FUD, but be aware that nation states are a problem in the healthcare sector right now, as well as all that criminality that we've been talking about. Okay, so the federal government again has noticed that there's this difference between the public harm that is caused by disruption to the healthcare sector versus the private responsibility to make sure it doesn't happen, and that's a disconnect. And so a number of things have come out where the federal government is, really breaking some ground that I think really should have been addressed a long time ago. So number one, they changed the rhetoric, how they talk about the use of ransomware, in particular against critical infrastructure. That's you. And it's also, dams, water, finance, energy, there's a whole bunch of stuff, right? But healthcare is one right at the top of that list. And if you use ransomware now in a health institution to flatten the network for the purpose of extortion, you are no longer a criminal. Now you're a terrorist. Just that rhetorical change made a lot of people step back and go, okay, wait a minute, right? Because now, we have a whole new toolbox we can use against these actors. The Department of Treasury, through an existing authority called the Office of Foreign Asset Control, has started to add crypto exchanges to the list of you may not use this. Just like you can't send money to Iran, there's crypto exchanges you can't use because they're commonly used for extortion payment. Okay, that's one way to stop this. The Department of Defense and Defend Forward. Well, what does Defend Forward mean? Well, it means melt the networks of these guys before they can launch their campaign, and they have been doing that. The Department of Justice, the FBI, we're snatching criminals. And, when we sanction criminals, these actors, they go on a list and, don't go for that, Bavarian holiday, because when you step off that plane, you're getting snatched. It's, in my opinion, we ought to be doing what we used to do with other terrorists, the whole rendition thing, extraordinary rendition. But people don't like it when I talk that way. Incentives for vendors to secure their products. This is part of the National Cybersecurity Strategy, which is a very interesting set of proposals, some of which are going to require legislation. So, for example, one of the things they want to do is they want to move the liability for product security onto the manufacturers. And that means a liability framework is going to have to be developed and approved by Congress. Not likely. Not likely with this Congress, probably not likely with any Congress. But still, they have the right reason, right? Shifting responsibility for security onto the vendors, and by means of using the federal purse, right? Which is, this is the way everybody should do it. If you can't prove this thing is secure, I'm not going to buy it. It needs to be part of your procurement process, right? You evaluate on price, right? Features, etc. How it fits in your environment, and security. And then finally, they and this was a long time ago, they gave us the NIST cybersecurity framework, which, as Fred pointed out, is now the tool of choice, as communicated by HHS, to use for your annual risk assessment. So we're going to dive into this thing a little bit. But I think one key thing that has come out, there are a lot of different regulatory pressures, and some way to consolidate those to minimize the effort and the resources that you need to expend to do this is a good idea. And so we're gonna land on that at the end. But go ahead. Anybody else want to say anything about what FedGov has been doing here?
I think one of the important things is the upcoming release of the NIST CSF 2.0, which will add a govern here. But I think that if folks are interested in hearing more about the NIST CSF, we just did another webinar about that on our YouTube channel. You can go and watch that. It's fascinating, and coming to a NIST CSF near you.
Yeah, and smash that like button. Just kidding. Okay, so here's this is an extract here from the protect, or I guess this is identify, the identify domain of the NIST cybersecurity framework. And currently the domains are identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. As Jake said, governance is going to be added. It's actually going to be extracted from the identify bucket and turned into its own thing. And you will notice that when Fred was talking about the different regulatory requirements, especially when we're talking about, and this is more aligned with finance than anything else, but in particular for publicly traded organizations, you need someone who is responsible and accountable for security, and you need all the way up to board representation. Board meetings need to have somebody in there who knows how to translate all of our secret handshake language into business terms that can be understood by boards of directors and executives. These are becoming more and more like requirements that if you don't do them, you're going to get fined. Right now, there's a whole lot of talk, and the comment period just ended for the SEC's proposal to do mandatory reporting in 4 days. There's a lot of pushback on that. So a lot of this stuff isn't really established yet, but it's clear where it's all going. So we took the CSF, the cybersecurity framework, and rather than alignment with a standard of practice, which is its original intent, we can turn it into a risk assessment tool by adding these columns for the likelihood of a bad thing going wrong as a result of a control outcome that's not completely met, and the consequence of that outcome. So what's a bad outcome that we don't want? It's not our website got SQL injected and defaced. That's not it, right? It's not we got ransomware. That's not it. Well, it kind of is, but it's really, if you abstract this to the things that are going to cost a business money, it's unauthorized disclosure of protected records. It's theft through potentially business email compromise and some of the other, fraudulent means. It's extortion through either ransomware or just holding records in abeyance. It is getting knocked down for the sake of getting knocked down, like the Iranians are going around doing right now to Israel and other countries. And it's being used as that third party to attack your business partners, right? Being that launch point. So there's really 5 things, simplify this. Can one of those 5 things happen? How likely, because we don't fully meet that control, how likely is one of those things to happen? All right. So in our first line example here, all right, do we know everything that's on the network? Nobody knows what's on the network. Nobody knows everything that's on the network. It's a good thing to work toward. I think we are close. But obviously, everybody needs to improve here. Okay. How likely is it you could lose records, you could be extorted, et cetera, because you don't know everything that's on the network? That's probably a low likelihood. It's not impossible, right? I work a lot in the public sector, and I know there's Windows 2003 servers run under police officers' desks. I know this. And what would the consequence of that be? All right. Especially if we're talking about extortion, it could be all the way up to existential if you are in a healthcare organization that's already financially on the ropes. All right. And then what do we do about it? Well, we're going to mitigate it. All these are pull downs that we have built into the spreadsheet here. And I will say I am not fully responsible for this. I've worked with others on this. My
I will
friend
say,
Lou over at Clear Channel gets a lot of credit for this. Yes, Jake.
and I will say, if folks are interested in that spreadsheet, you can shoot me an email, or we'll send it out as a handout to everybody who's in this webinar. I'll put my email address in the chat there.
Yeah, and that's. Go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the highlights from that update NIST 2.0 is the governance piece, right? Because for far too long it's been seen that it's an IT problem, and now it's going to shift to an organization. So those organizations that are going to follow along with the new guidelines from HHS, which is a very smart move by HHS, that's going to be in that whole ball court of everybody that's involved with the organization. And those teams that are doing it, or are going to point to start doing it, are going to be farther ahead than the ones that sit on the sidelines.
Yeah. Yeah, just in terms of governance and like really quickly, it's important for you to have, if you are a practitioner, to have a governance organization where once you identify risks, you can get others' fingerprints on them. You don't want to be the sole person responsible for going, well, we accepted that risk. I mean, if there's something that you think you ought to mitigate through controls or transfer through insurance, right, you got to raise your hand and talk about that. And if somebody overrides you from an executive level and says, no, we will accept that risk, that's fine. That's perfectly legal. But those fingerprints are now on there. So that's the way I look at governance. Okay. Okay. So here's the other half of that same few lines you were just looking at. So you figure out what your risk is by multiplying together likelihood and consequence. Okay, something little times something big is something in the middle, right? We try to make this really simple. And then how are you going to deliver? How are you going to mitigate that, right? We're going to do this with internal resources. We're going to make a capital purchase. We're going to hire consultants or a managed service. And then there's places there where you can set your desired maturity level. I've arbitrarily set it at 3 across the board because that's probably the upper limit of what's achievable by most. And then how you estimate your own maturity there. And what you get out of this is spider charts that show your maturity, pie charts that show where risk is concentrated, and what you need to do in terms of creating a corrective action roadmap. So when you're done with this, you've done your annual risk assessment, you've got a corrective action plan that you can run out probably as a 2-year roadmap. You've figured out what things are going to cost, because if you say, well, we're going to do this with internal resources, it's probably going to take 20 hours to work. Average pay rate is $50 an hour. There you go. And you've got a crosswalk against these other regulatory requirements, which actually that's very valuable. And so I'll just paraphrase this because I know Fred's going to do a dive into this here pretty quickly. If you take credit cards and you have health records and financial information and you're regulated by all these things, every one of them says you got to have a firewall, but you only have to have a firewall once. So if you compress all these, you do the least amount of work for the greatest amount of compliance. And that makes a lot of sense. So what do they call this, Fred? At one point it was called unified compliance. You're on mute.
Fred, you're on mute.
Unified approach to compliance, correct.
Okay. Okay, I think that's all I want to say about this. Next slide. Oh, yeah. You got to manage all that stuff too. So if you're doing it right and you are happily checking off all your compliance boxes and you've met a standard of practice and you know you can survive an audit, this is what you were doing. And a lot of these things have to be done on a very regular cadence. For example, going through your vulnerability scan and making sure that nothing new popped up that you need to address immediately. But the big thing is here on the column on the right, there are a lot of things that need to be done annually. Got to do a pen test, got to do a risk assessment, got to do a policy review. You should be doing a tabletop exercise, on and on and on. So every quarter, it's important that probably 2 of those things get ticked off the list. So this quarter for us is a big policy review. It's third-party vendor risk management, and we're doing our own tabletop exercise and a penetration test all this quarter. So if you're doing it right, this is all going to get in. Somebody's got to manage this stuff. So you can't just have a corrective action roadmap and go, well, here's all the stuff we're going to have to do. Somebody's going to have to manage that, and that's internal resources, and you need to tally all of this up. And so a rough for a average sized organization, like a 25 hospital bed, this is about 450 hours of work to manage this.
And Fred, you want to explain crosswalking too. This is a really important thing for folks.
Sure. I do quickly want to say, and that's why they added the NIST govern function, because the things Mike just talked about are not getting the attention they need. You have to run the program, not just have controls in place. So what is crosswalking? Mike did a good job of setting the stage. The approach, when you take a unified approach to compliance or meeting a set of standards, it's really saying to yourself, what is the most overarching standard I need to adhere to? Maybe HIPAA, could be PCI, could be any number, but look at all the regulatory requirements that apply in your environment. Pick the most stringent standard, use that as a key. And then you can go out and download. There are sites that will create them for you, but you say, if this is my main key, let's call it PCI, what does that mean, as Mike showed, in terms of HIPAA? What does it mean in terms of if I'm giving credit of some kind, GLBA, whatever potential regulatory, or if I'm a BA and I'm getting handed, here are the requirements you need to adhere to. I want to include those as well, right? I have to adhere to those requirements. And you build a matrix saying, here's my most stringent standard. Here is the elements of that. You should have a firewall. You should have an IR plan. You should have, right, a vulnerability management program. And then there's a column that says, and for the ISO or for GLBA or PCI, it maps to this particular control. And then it may have a note that says, but that's not everything that lands under that control. So you end up with your most rigorous standard as your key. You have your findings. Yes, we have this control in place. No, we do not. You have then a column that says, and for these other regulatory requirements, we are meeting them. If we're meeting them here for our main control, we're meeting them for our auxiliary control. So in this fashion, you're putting together a program that addresses everything holistically. You assess once. You do have to do a little bit of work to understand what applies in each environment. So your PCI controls may not need to spill over completely into your HIPAA environment, or you may be able to take a lesser degree of control because it's not prescriptive like the PCI environment. So it's taking all these requirements, putting them into a master approach, so you're addressing them all singularly at one time with one program. That's what crosswalking is.
And Jonathan, I mean, that's not that's not the easiest thing to do if you're at a critical access hospital or a regional hospital. How do you get it done in that kind of environment?
You seek out good partners. It's impossible because a lot of these small hospitals, like critical access hospitals, don't have the IT team to support it. So whether you do that in-house, get with your regulatory compliance person in-house or your C-suite, or find really good partners. That's the only way you can accomplish these things. You have to outsource at some point in time.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've certainly talked to folks that, that have tried to do it themselves. And then, Fred and I were just talking today about, larger organizations that have enough people to do it, but want to be able to hand it off to somebody to do, right, Fred?
Yeah, well, things like this that are kind of, you want an outside view. You don't want people that are basically have a biased inside view. It's something that happens once a year. It's not something that you keep in your back pocket and you keep doing as part of your day-to-day work. It's something you break out once a year. So why not hand it off to people that specialize in doing this, can get it done the fastest, can get it done with an approach that aligns with a set of skills that, again, you're not using all the time. So it makes sense that some of these things that are outside what you do every day, don't do them, right? Get somebody else that does it. They'll do it probably less expensive overall than if you had your own team doing that.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of letting other folks do it, I don't want to we're going to hit Hannah's question here. I love it. I was going to say, we do that work for folks. We do risk assessments, technical testing. It's all part of Prepare. We also detect and respond. Mike was talking about all of those nation states and the CISA alerts. You can get all of those if you go to our website and sign up for Mike's daily IT security news blast, which he's done himself for 15 years. And of course, sign up for security awareness training. All right, Fred, I want to hit Hannah's question here. She says, personally, I disagree with outsourcing. You increase your risk 1,000%. I love it.
So
I know and Hannah says not a question. I know, I love it. Go ahead, Fred.
Okay, yeah. So 1,000% is a little high. So I mean, everything has risk. There's no question that everything you do has risk. So you need to pick who you outsource to appropriately, and really like anything, it's understanding your vendor. So anytime you hand it, you should have probably a third-party risk management program. Something that sets the standards you believe your vendor should maintain. You should assess your vendors, include that stuff in your business associate agreements. And again, if you have to, you potentially outsource, that risk to insurance, right? So you try to transfer that risk. So nothing is without risk here. It's all about picking good vendors. I will say that you'll find a lot of and this is not to put down MSPs. They do a great job at what they do, but if they added security assessments last week as a service,
beware.
Yeah, that's probably not where you want to spend your money, even if it is a really reasonable price. So keep in mind, not only do you get what you pay for in terms of the product that you receive, you get what you pay for in terms of the security that's backing up that product. And when it's your own data or your own information, that's pretty important.
Awesome.
The other thing that I would say about that too, as well, is I was there. I was in that hot seat, right? I could not pay somebody. I couldn't pay enough people to do security 24/7 at my site. I just didn't have the staff. I couldn't find the people to come there. It was far cheaper solution to outsource that than it was to try and do it in-house anyways. So you got to pick your battles. I chose managed detection response as one of my battles that I really needed help and assistance with. That was something that just is not within the realm of scope from the IT size teams that I had. And so sometimes you've got to point to an outside source to help you along.
I wanted to say Monica's suggestion to go to P2PE technology if you're taking credit cards is a 100. That's 1,000% yes on that right there. That one warrants 1,000% yes. That will reduce your footprint to a level that almost makes it negligible. The only things you're really concerned about with now are certain elements of your people and the people that are handling those systems. Even though it's absolutely minimal, they still need to have security awareness training that aligns them with the PCI standards. But that is a great recommendation.
All right. And as we wrap up the time here, every time we do a webinar, we ask for feedback. And my colleague Ginny is going to put in the chat a survey. And we'd really appreciate feedback from folks. Was this useful? Was this helpful? Did you want it to be shorter, longer? Did you want more detail on something? And so Ginny is going to put that in the chat. And, the other thing, and we asked questions as we went through, so we don't have time for question now. My email address is up there. As I said, if you want that spreadsheet, you can email me or you can email Mike, and he's been helping walk people through it. And so we'll send that out to you. You can either email us or there's a Calendly link with our colleague Ellie who manages calendars for us, and that's in the chat as well. But really take that survey. We'd really appreciate your feedback. And for everybody who takes the survey, we give money to a charity called the Society for Information Management, which helps folks out with learning. All right, let's do final thoughts from everybody. Jonathan, we'll start with you, then we'll go to Mike, and then Fred. Jonathan, final thoughts.
Yeah, I think the new standards for the NIST framework and the alignment with HHS is a win for IT administration. Really push that governance into making that a whole organizational environment, and that will change your workload as an administrator.
Mike, final thoughts.
There is an expectation that everybody's management of security is going to be as full-featured as Lockheed. And everybody's just going to have to climb on board this bandwagon. There's incentives that the government is providing, but there are going to be a lot of balls in the air. There's a lot of moving parts to this. So hopefully you captured, or we can give you this presentation, right? If you're doing it right slide, that's what you need to take to your executives and go, we need to be doing all of this.
Yep. All right, Fred, final thoughts.
Yeah, the move to the NIST with its approach is totally in alignment with what we always had wanted HIPAA to be. That is, it can't be one size fits all. A rural critical access hospital has a completely different set of required controls than a multi-state, 50 hospital consortium. So an outcome-based approach is exactly what the doctor ordered, to use a poor cliche here. And we fully support this approach. It's the right thing to do.
Cool. And Fred, I want you to know that bad jokes are my responsibility. And I feel like you took that from me today. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Shoot us an email with any questions. Again, if you want that spreadsheet, shoot me a note or schedule some time on that calendar. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, everybody, for joining us on behalf of Jonathan and Mike and Fred. Have a great Have a great and safe day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.